and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we will be talking about the 1954 film Them, which was directed by Gordon Douglas and produced by David Weisbart, who would go on to direct A Rebel Without a Cause, as well as a few Elvis Presley films. The story that this film was based on was written by George Worthing Yates, who would go on to write screenplays for a slew of other science fiction films. So let's get to our wonderful guests. And as always, there are spoilers ahead. Thomas Doherty is a professor of American Studies at Brandeis University. He has a special interest in Hollywood cinema and has written extensively on the subject, including the book Teenagers and Teenpics, the Juvenilization of American Movies in the 1950s. Welcome to the show, Thomas. How are you?
I'm fine, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Matthew Rule-Jones is Senior Lecturer of Film Studies at the University of Exeter. He is author of, amongst other books, Science Fiction Cinema and 1950s Britain, Recontextualizing Cultural Anxiety. Welcome to the show, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. I wanted to start off with talking about Them as the first big bug film. So it's not the first nuclear monster film, but Thomas, can you talk about why they went with big bugs at this time?
I think what's going on here is a kind of a backfire and a expression of the hydrogen bomb in 1952. And that's very much in the background of this great wave of science fiction, disaster, apocalyptic films. Now, needless to say that the atomic bomb is dropped in 1945, and that's made reference to a couple of times explicitly in the movie Them, which takes place in New Mexico, and of course the ants have been radioactively, zapped by the nuclear blast. But many of the reviews at the time speak of the hydrogen bomb, and I think that is the moment that American and world culture realizes that we now have a device that can destroy mankind. That you can kind of get your mind around the atomic bomb as being like, 10,000 tons of TNT. And what it does to Hiroshima and Nagasaki is kind of what it, we did to Dresden and Cologne, or the firebombing of Tokyo. The hydrogen bomb is a qualitatively a disastrous leap forward. So when it's detonated in November of 1952, the next weeks, American newspapers and magazines would all have like illustrations on the front page of like the blast radius of Boston and how everything would be wiped out from Boston to Worcester up to New Hampshire. And people really now do have the image of annihilation. So much of the science fiction that comes out of the post 1952 time period is about that sense of annihilation. And I think that Them is one of the first films that captures that, because the ants will take over and humanity will be wiped out, which gives these films kind of, the stakes are much higher to get rid of that queen ant in the sewers of Los Angeles.
Warner Brothers had a very big hit with The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which is also a nuclear monster. And this film was supposed to be both in 3D and in color. Now, the 3D element, 3D was dying. But is there a reason, or do you know if there's a reason why they chose not to go full color with this?
Expense would be one thing. And then I think you're probably also by this time thinking of the television market, that by the later 50s, the syndication rights for TV would have been something that the studios would have on their mind. Although, as I recall, you actually get one brief color title where the word Them ! Isn't red.
Right at the start.
In the last couple of days, and Matt, and maybe you have something to say about this as well. I've been trying to get at what makes Them so special, that there are a whole bunch of bug films and science fiction films, but there's something about Them that really kind of hits you. And it has a narrative propulsion and a kind of verisimilitude about it that, to me, makes that film kind of a couple notches above something like Tarantula, which it would seem to have so many similarities to in location, bug, etc. But Tarantula is, to me, like very much a B minus, where Them is an A level science fiction apocalyptic bug movie.
I think, Matt, it would be quite interesting to hear your first experience of watching this film and how you responded to it.
Yeah, I had a pretty weird first experience watching this. It's atypical. In that I was born in 84. I was not around in the 50s. I had very little kind of consciousness of 50s science fiction as a kid, growing up in Midlands, England. And I found myself I guess I was probably 8 or 9, on one lazy Sunday afternoon. We had just got kittens in the house. And so I was having a time on the sofa with a cup of tea and a kitten who fell asleep on my lap, and it was excellent. But then, of course, I was imprisoned there because you can't move a sleeping cat. That is frankly heartless. So I was stranded on the sofa watching whatever came onto the telly, and then came on, and it was just perfect Sunday afternoon. Relaxing, vaguely kind of nostalgic even at that age. There's a sense of watching 50s movies, black and white movies. There's a sense of something from long ago. I was even cognizant of that then, but also it was just a bloody brilliant movie, right? It properly knocked my socks off. I think Tom's absolutely spot on when he says that it is head and shoulders above a lot of the comparable movies from the period. I've got some thoughts about why that might be, but for me at the time, as a kid in the, I guess, probably early 90s, I was just absolutely entranced by it. It was the first film of its type that I'd seen. It was probably the first science fiction film that I saw, first, serious in inverted commas, for adult, I suppose, because calling them serious is it raises all sorts of question marks. But the first adult science fiction movie I'd seen, and so I became very much aware of this kind of this genre that was out there, but also this one film that I could never track down again. There wasn't internet at the time, so I found myself on this bizarre kind of few decades hunt for this film that I didn't know what it was called. I didn't know really what it was about because memory fades over time, but I was aware that there were giant things in the desert that were out to get you. And that stuck with me. It really stuck with me. It lodged itself somewhere up here. And years later, when the internet came out and eBay became a thing, I managed to, I remembered one day that this existed and I tracked it down. But it had given me this sense of other types of science fiction, other types of film that were out there, slightly jankier, I think, probably, slightly less polished. Looking back from the 90s, from the 50s, of course, those were astonishing special effects, nominated for an Oscar, actually, for a special effects, this movie. But looking back as a kid in the 90s, it looked different. It felt different. It felt less controlled than a lot of science fiction of the time. If you compare it with the big blockbuster science fiction movies I was growing up with, it felt less certain. It felt more questioning. It felt more horrific, I think, than a lot of things I'd seen. So the little kid in me was absolutely in love with all of that, of course. But I'm let me come out formally on your podcast. I'm gay. I was a queer kid in the 90s growing up, and I remember distinctly being in love with the idea that there were menaces out there that were ready to tear down the world order, that there was something out there that was threatening to the way that society was organized, and that, had all these army boys and FBI men in a panic because there was something they couldn't quite comprehend out there. And I think there is something about that. I still find, we talk about the campy appeal of 50s sci-fi, and I think Them does have a campy appeal, right? Like, it's also a wonderful, wonderful movie, and I don't want to make it sound like it's only appealing for its campy values, but it is appealing for its campy values. Giant ants in the desert, what's not to love about the silliness of that, as well as Tom rightly points out, like the sheer horror of the moment of it. But there's something about science fiction films in general that, because of that uncontainedness of them, because of that sense that you can't quite pin them down, that they don't follow the rules of science fiction movies that I grew up with, there was always something a bit other about them too. And so even as a 9-year-old kid, I remember sitting on that sofa and going, yeah, maybe we should be tearing down like the world around us. Maybe like if the world doesn't want me in it, maybe I'm on the ant side here.
Very interesting. It reminds me of Susan Sontag's essay, which is The Imagination of Disaster, which I will put in the show notes, and it has been mentioned before on the podcast. But the setup, which is, again, it's really common in these 1950s films to have sleepy town USA versus this kind of like extreme, horrendous, whatever it is that's coming out to get them. And it's interesting because you've got, the way Susan Sontag describes it is almost like boredom versus terror. Like they're both equally, terrifying. And that kind of average life of, suburbia versus this kind of very exciting, but like terrifying, well, in this case, giant ants.
When I teach the 50s in classes, I always use two words, affluence and anxiety. So you got this wartime generation that is coming out of the Great Depression and World War II, and they're now in an environment that is like paradisial compared to what they grew up in. And however, at any moment it can be taken away, because this is the generation that experienced the stock market crash in Pearl Harbor. So even though they're living in this remarkably affluent and peaceful and prosperous culture, there is the sense that it can all blast away. Of course, the obvious thing is with nuclear war, but then the ants become the metaphor for that. And we have this very elaborate security structure at both the state level, the character of James Whitman as this wonderful policeman who's resourceful and affectionate, and then the expert FBI guy, played by James Arness, along with a couple of scientists from the Department of Agriculture who are coming in to sort of regulate and control the situation. And then once again, the American infrastructure of security and military will be marshaled, just like in World War II, to defeat the enemy. So you have all this World War II background as well, where, I mean, every time I see those shots of James Whitmore with the flamethrower going into the ant nest and then into the sewers of LA with his flamethrower, the visual backstory is the Pacific War, where Marines are going into caves to exterminate the Japanese, who are figured as bugs that need to be annihilated during World War II. And so that last sequence, especially where you have the military and the jeeps and the uniformed men and the flamethrowers, has this echo that I think for audiences at the time would have been very resonant. And I think we might miss that today. Cut to 50 years later, you don't think of that this military that has recently protected us from the Japanese is now going to protect us from the bugs. And of course, the Japanese are the people we bomb with the nukes, and the people that we annihilate in the caves with the flamethrowers. So I think that resonance is going on in the film in a very powerful way, the American security state protecting us against visitation from afar.
That's actually really interesting. I just wanted to point out that I found something which Warner Brothers, when they send out their press book, which apparently is a promotional thing that they send out when they have a book, they advise theatre managers who are screening them to contact their nearest armed forces to come to the theatres and encourage people to join the army and I think the tagline was something along the lines of, what would you do if X city were attacked by them? And it's interesting because them could mean anything. In this, it means giant ants. But it's very funny that that's kind of hand in hand with a way to sell the film, especially in light of what you've just said.
And that's, of course, World War II as well, where during World War II, war films would be shown, and then you could actually join up in the lobby of the theater where they'd have military recruiters. So you could say you could watch Pride of the Marines and then actually enlist into the Marines in the lobby.
And Matt, I had it in one of the discussions I had with you. You were talking about how, and obviously this is an American film, shown in America, but shown in many different places. But you were talking about how the messages kind of change in these 1950s films depending on, well, I suppose for you, the US compared to the UK. Can you just talk a little bit about those differences?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, that's fascinating listening to Tom talk about the place that this would hold within the American kind of public imagination of the time, the way that connects to those kind of codes around the war, because it was doing exactly the same thing in Britain, but radically differently. So over here, if you look at British science fiction in the period, there's a tendency to put the threat at home, often in the major cities. So rather than setting it out in the desert, or, I guess our version of that would be like, the Peak District, and then having the monsters come in from outside. It often is a threat already at the heart of the metropole, at the heart of London. And that largely allows them to draw on the British experience of the Second World War, of evacuation, of air raid shelters, of that kind of architecture of civil defence during the Second World War. So you actually get a lot of films that were shot in the rubble of the period. During the 1950s, Reconstruction was still going on in the UK. It was a slow process. It wasn't really, Tom talks absolutely rightly about American rising living standards, affluence, the kind of paradisical nature of life in the States for many, not for all, of course, at that time. In the UK and across most of Europe, we had exactly the opposite experience, where the 50s was a really bloody rough time. And we lagged behind America in terms of economic growth quite significantly. So we were looking at images of Americans with luxury items like fridges, which, the Brits just couldn't afford at the time. In my book, I've got some stats around a percentage of families that owned a fridge, and it's just worlds apart. So the British were having a really rough time. Rationing was still in effect from the war during this period. Britain was very much living in the ruins of the war, and that was also true, and perhaps much more true, in Italy, in Germany, in all of these places where these films were shipped out to. Crucial market for America. Europe was like the crucial market for American cinema outside of the States during this period. And actually, by the end of this decade, there were, Hollywood was making most of its money outside the States and not from inside it. So for audiences elsewhere who weren't seeing this kind of threat to the paradise they were living in, there were other pleasures to be found here. And so those kind of that threat to the city from outside rings slightly differently in the European imagination. Particularly, I should imagine, if one were in places like Dresden, for instance, the threat of fire coming from outside to eradicate you. One wonders how much that positions you on the side of the ants rather than the Americans. And when Tom talks about how for Americans this was about the bomb both on their side, but also this kind of threat of extinction. Well, if anything, that threat was more acute in the UK. We effectively, you drop a nuclear bomb on London, the rest of the country is done for because London's gone, right? We're a smaller country, we're an island, we're easily nuked out of existence in that regard. So, whereas the threat that Boston might be nuked, if you're in California, okay, so what? I'm being flippant, of course, but if London were nuked, if a couple of bombs fell on the UK, then that was it. It was over. So the threat of nuclear apocalypse rang even more true in Britain, and perhaps made some of these images even more loaded or even more pregnant with atomic era horror. Also, at the same time, Britain was really going in for nuclear power at the same time too. So as well as the nuclear threat, Britain was at the forefront of civil uses of nuclear technology. We opened the world's first nuclear reactor for civil purposes in the UK, up in Cumbria, which is now the Sellafield site, but at the time was Seascale and Windscale. And that was framed as part of Britain's emergence from the horrors of the war. Nuclear technology was going to save the country as well as destroy the country. At a time when America was expanding and welcoming in its 49th and 50th states during this period, Britain was shrinking. The empire was collapsing around it. So its world influence was waning. Its territory was waning whilst America was growing. So we've got these two very different experiences of the 1950s. And actually, I'd argue that the US experience of this applies only really to the US. The US had a very unique experience of the post-war period, whereas basically across Europe, it was a grim old time, right? So I think these other readings of it, these kind of readings where, yes, there's nuclear apocalypse, but also perhaps there's promise in science as well. It's the scientists who are the heroes here in the end, ultimately. And perhaps that promise of science is something that rang true much more than the threat of science in an age where, goodness knows, people here needed something to hope for.
Yeah, it's interesting because we, last time Tom was on, in fact, we talked about mad scientists. So it's gone from that kind of scientists are very, very bad to, yes, scientists are bad because they made the nuclear bomb, but also they're the ones in this film who are there to save the day. So it's almost like science becomes a bit more neutral again.
Better living through chemistry. And in the film, you also have that cooperation between the world of science and the world of the military, which you also have in The Thing from Another World as well. So where in Tarantula, the scientist, although he's trying to do good stuff, is basically responsible for letting giant spiders loose, in the landscape. So there's always the doubleness to the role of the scientist, who's somebody that, unlike the military guy, he's doing stuff that most of us can't understand. And he usually has to explain what he does to us slow students in the audience. So both them and Tarantula have an instructional scene where they explain to us the world of the ants and the world of the spider.
There's like a little mini documentary in them, which is quite adorable.
Right. And part of the, I think the value of them and why we like it so much is just the acting of what's his name, Edmund Gwen as this
the
really
main scientist in the
Ed, you there? That's not the way to put in a call, Doctor. We're Search Able, call Search Baker. Right, General?
Right. Oh. Search Able to Search Baker.
Say over. Then say over.
Over?
Medford and Baker to Medford and Able. Go ahead, Dad. Over.
Have you found anything yet?
Say over.
I just said it.
I know, say it again.
Oh. Over.
And he's such a great scientist. He's rumpled and absent-minded, and he doesn't know how to, operate a walkie-talkie. And his hipper daughter, who is much more a creature of modern 1950s science, who is like right on it immediately, not rumpled at all. And so the character playing adds so much to them, where in most of these films, the acting's kind of bad. The characters are not particularly resonant. And if I might, one of the focus on, not maybe the kind of the scientific bug part of it, but one of the things that gives this movie a heart that some of these movies don't have is the character of James Whitmore as the policeman, who at the beginning of the film is immediately, when you see him, he is so paternal and affectionate towards the traumatized girl, that great girl who's, with the eyes.
Oh, her acting, yeah. I think she's wonderful.
She's one of the best actresses ever, because you absolutely believe that she has been traumatized by giant ants. And her playing and also his affection, the way he takes her in his arms and, puts her next to him in the cop car, and she falls asleep on him and he has to get out. He's very careful not to disturb her. And then later, of course, the callback on that is he sacrifices himself with the two children in the sewers of LA.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you're watching it, and although that does stand out, his kind of his caring and kindness, I felt like there wasn't really a hero coming through, because you get it is an ensemble cast and you have a lot of different people there, but obviously towards the end you're like, oh yeah, no, he's the hero. But it's interesting that they didn't go for like a lot of films of this time, and I think for a Hollywood film it's strange to not have the hero.
Well, you expect James Arness to have the big moment, and because he's so huge, and he later goes on to play Matt Dillon in Gunsmoke, and he's the FBI agent who is the definitive figure of American surveillance state order, the expert who will come in and solve the crime. But in the end, it becomes this kind of average cop who, for some reason, is positioned at the table with all the generals. They just kind of promote him from being a sergeant in the police force in New Mexico into being one of the main guys.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, though, isn't it? Because that allows it allows for the ants to become the focus, right? Like if we have this ensemble cast, yes, there is kind of flashes of hero-ness here and there, but it's not kind of your traditional setup, right? And that allows a vacuum to emerge for the audience. You know, where are you looking if you're not watching your hero's journey? Well, perhaps we're watching the ants after all. Perhaps they're the stars of the show.
So I wanted to talk about ants. We have mentioned them, but this is a bit of a departure from your usual monsters. Not going forward, because there's lots of big bugs that are about to come, but the ant's not really as sympathetic as something like the creature from the Black Lagoon, even. Nowhere near as sympathetic as Frankenstein or King Kong. Why have they made such an unsympathetic monster?
Are they unsympathetic? I think they're kind of cute, really. I take the point. But at the time, actually, one of my PhD students wrote about this, a chap called Liam Jones. He was writing about actually that there were quite a lot of fears of nature, of wildlife, of bugs and pests in American society at the time, particularly as we were talking about, America getting back on its feet, the farming industry, agriculture and so forth, kind of needing to cater for a booming population. There was a lot of worry that the natural world might turn on America, that, that would be the end of us all, would be these things lurking underneath the surface. Or alternatively, and perhaps more so in later years, that pesticides might turn on us, and that, the modern science in that field would destroy the world one day. So there's an argument to be made that actually these bugs are just bugs and they're scary because they were scary, right?
And in that kind of subtext, there is some kind of hint that they're a bit communist, aren't they, ants?
They're certainly collective. They're a collective society.
They're into their workers.
Ants are the only creatures on Earth, other than man, who make war. They campaign. They are chronic aggressors. And they make slave laborers of the captives they don't kill. None of the ants previously seen by man were more than an inch in length, most considerably under their size. But even the most minute of them have an instinct and talent for industry, social organization, and savagery that makes man look feeble by comparison.
Yeah, the communist bank story and the fact that the worker ants are like the proletariat, and ants are the only other creatures, as the scientist explains to us, who wage war. And you do get the sense that the ants are sort of a potential Soviet system that is going to overtake America. So that subtext is there as well.
So we've got the ants as nuclear force, as nuclear bomb. We've got the ants as communist society in waiting. We've got there's also, I think this is Mark Yankovic in his book on this. We've got the ants as a female-led society and kind of gender trouble bubbling up beneath the surface.
They are,
in the
queen
UK,
ants
we've got
the most dangerous, definitely.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And then we've got these kind of international readings of it where different tensions and those existing tensions kind of read differently in different cultures. So they're symbols, these ants, right? They're a vacuum waiting to be filled. And
I think that's why a lot of these things work. I mean, sometimes the symbolism is really obvious and quite beautiful, but it's kind of the fun in the interpretation, or at least for me, that they can be different things. Just leading on from the anti-feminist potential ants that are, women taking over, which, we're always trying to do, but it never works. So aside from that, I wanted to talk about the women in this film, or woman. The films do get a bad reputation, and to some degree, understandably so, because there's so many scream queens and women who don't seem to be able to function when confronted by terrifying aliens or ants. I actually think in this, Pat, who's a scientist, Dr. Pat, is actually quite interesting because, there's a romance that develops between her and James Arness's character, and then they have to go down underground to kind of confront these ants. And she just gives him what for?
A trained observer has to go into the nest.
What for?
There are more important things to find out than whether all the ants are dead. You wouldn't know what to look for.
Well, you tell us what to look for.
Look, Bob, there's no time to give you a fast course in insect pathology. So let's stop all the talk and get on with it.
Okay.
So I think the idea that we live in a post-war society in which the kindling of feminism is being born, is quite an interesting one. What do you think, Tom?
Well, yeah, and it's always a misnomer to think that women were sent back to the homes after World War II. That, as a lot of feminist critics have pointed out, that there are actually more women in the workforce in the 1950s than there were in the 1940s, and she is a real wonderful emblem of that. And the feminist reading is wonderful because not only does she insist that she's the expert that needs to go down to identify the queen, but what I think is really interesting is the jerk male that you would expect from James Arness, the FBI agent, as he's getting all patriarchal on her, kind of immediately concedes the logic of the case in both instances, both when they go down into the nest and then when they go into the sewers of L.A., that of course you're going to have the expert around. The father is too weak to be able to do this, and he utterly is persuaded by her quite reasonable and logical argument that, yeah, she's the one that has to go down.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the various sounds in this film, which I think are quite interesting. The actual ant sounds are made of bird whistles, and then they're artificially pitched by a technician. And it's such a terrible noise. And I can imagine that in the 1950s. I mean, even now, the way horror films and science fiction films use noise in cinema is fantastic. Such a grating and wonderful sound. Aside from that, I wanted to mention something which I only learnt about within the last few months, and I think because I've been doing research for this, but the Wilhelm Scream, which actually I'll let one of you speak about it. Which one of you wants to speak about it?
Matt, you should take the Wilhelm Scream. In fact, you should do the Wilhelm.
If I could do the Wilhelm Scream, I'd be making money in Hollywood. The Wilhelm Scream was a sound effect that was recorded and used repeatedly. It became the scream. It was an easily accessible sound effect that was kind of embedded then within studios. It was first used, I think, 2 to 3 years maybe before them.
So 1951, Western called Distant Drums is where it was first originated, yes.
Marvellous. You're a font of knowledge, Aisha. Thank you. So this was, 3 years before then, this scream is first recorded, and then it goes on to be used everywhere. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Every kind of horror film, science fiction film from this period, it uses this scream again and again and again because it was cheap, it was there, it was readily accessible, it was scary, it was about the right scream. And it takes you out once you know to listen for it. It takes you out of the film every single time. So every film from this period that is trying to be scary, all of a sudden there's this familiar. It's like your alarm clock going off, right? You hear it so many times, it finds its way into your thinking.
It's very comical, but also like you can tell the person who's screaming is terrified. So it's a wonderful scream. I just wanted to mention now it's almost, I've heard, become like almost an inside joke kind of thing. Like people use it. And so some of the films that have used it knowingly, Titanic, Reservoir Dogs, Lord of the Rings films, Toy Story, I bet it was great in Toy Story, and then also the Star Wars saga. I don't know if they were doing it comically then, but maybe they were. I don't know.
It's also used quite a lot in my lectures.
Is that you reenact it or you play it?
I'll leave that to your imagination, Aisha.
You were talking about the use of sound, and of course the Wilhelm Scream is wonderful. But those ant sounds that are kept, we keep the ants off camera for a good deal of the film, and we just get those sounds, which is very evocative because, of course, it gives you that off-screen, a sense of off-screen reality in space, and it allows our imagination to think of what those creatures are. And there's really a wonderful cinematic moment where the girl is being taken away in the ambulance, and you hear the what we now know is the ant sound, and she bolts upright on the ambulance bed, and it's such a startling moment. She doesn't say anything; she just kind of bolts upright, in back frame. Which I think is really one of the best devices that I've seen in a movie like that, a purely cinematic moment of terror.
I mean, I was thinking about this earlier, Tom, when you were saying about what makes this film stand out. That question's kind of stuck with me as we've been talking about what makes this film stand out as a really, really good 50s sci-fi horror rather than some of the lesser affairs, your list of which I would strongly contest, and we can fight to the death about that one day. But there's something about the kind of the absence at the start, right? The idea that that the girl has been attacked, that the general store is abandoned, that there's tracks in the sand, that something's not right. And what it's doing is creating a world away from what we see. It's doing that in terms of our imaginations of what has attacked this girl, of who left or what left the tracks in the sand. It does it through the noise, through the sound, what is making that sound elsewhere. And so there's a real strong kind of mystery to the first maybe half hour or so before we see the ants, before they figure out the ants, that puts it really into the horror genre. Science fiction is about explaining, about understanding, about coming to rationalize things. We get that in the second half of this movie, right? When the scientists start saying, oh, well, let me give you this, as actually, as you quite rightly say, let me give you this mini lecture where we'll kind of explain what's going on. The first half is not about explaining at all. It's about otherworldly weirdness. There's something kind of vaguely Lovecraftian about the noise drifting to you across the desert, right? This unknowable thing that just doesn't make sense and is out there somewhere, but you can't pin it down. It plays itself as a horror movie for at least its first half hour, if not a little bit more.
And these are really impressive. These are apparently, there's a 12-foot ant in this film. There are two main ants, and there's gears and pulleys and all these wonderful things, which is phenomenal for 1954, which is why it got nominated for an Oscar. They are very impressive.
They painted them as well because they thought they were going to shoot in color, as we kind of touched on earlier. So they thought that these were going to be in 3D and in color. So yeah, they had to make them look impressive because they knew they were going to be one of the visual draws of it. So they had to prepare the models in the knowledge that they could well be really quite visible for much of the movie. So it's, if anything, a little miracle that we get this movie that we do, where they're really not in it all that much.
Well, that's because everybody else in the film is really selling the fact that there are these terrifying insects out there. And again, I keep coming back to that girl who really sets the stage for all this. Like, if that girl didn't work at the very beginning, when we see her wandering through the desert, isolated in that aerial shot of the biplane coming in, and to see that her catatonic shock, just wandering through the field with her broken doll, and then later on in the ambulance and later on in the hospital room, that our terror of these ants comes from that girl. And
the girl is really important because sometimes especially in the 1950s, you get these really kind of cheesy, overacting, like they're a bit too sweet in a way, but she's not. She's just, as you said, in an absolute catatonic state.
Tom, as you were talking about the biplane shot and the kind of lookout over the desert, it's also the desert that does this too, though, right? Like the desert itself is crucial to this movie.
On location verisimilitude, that is not like a studio backlot, but it's clearly the real New Mexico landscape, which has the evocation of Alamogordo, which is where the creatures originate from. And you start seeing more of that in all kinds of films. Those aerial shots with helicopters or with planes, which you couldn't do with drones back in the day, and it took a little bit more choreography. I think that you have those authentic locations that also make us think that if you've ever been in the desert, it does have that sense of mystery and threat, that there could be something coming just out of your plane of vision around the horizon to get you.
Absolutely. I wanted to just mention the sewers and the bit towards the end are used in a few films, and they've kind of gained, like when you see them, I watched them and I was like, oh, they look really familiar. Apparently Grease has them, where the Grease race happens, and also one of my favourites, Terminator 2. That's where the truck's kind of going down and they're being chased by the evil Terminator.
That's the Los Angeles River, isn't it? Because the LA River, like, in order to preserve water, they've concreted the basin of it into like effectively a half pipe. If any kids were skater kids in the 90s like me, so the half pipe of the LA River it's become this absolutely iconic film thing. It's used all the time. The number of bodies that I've seen dumped on screen in the dry hollow of the concrete LA River.
Absolutely. Okay, I just wanted to touch upon we've mentioned it before, just what's happening in the US at this time. A lot of these films, extremely, extremely, extremely white. You don't generally see people of colour. But Tom, can you talk about a particular court case that may have had a very big impact on how society might be changing from 1954 onwards in the USA?
Well, 54 is such a key year. Of course, in America, so it's the year of the Brown versus the Board of Education case, in which the Supreme Court finally rules that separate but equal facilities in education are inherently unequal, and then orders that the American school system, with all deliberate speed, that was the phrase they used, had to desegregate. So you're starting to see, and some of this, of course, comes in American cinema before the 1954 decision, because with the Office of War Information ethos during the Second World War, you're starting to see in the social problem films, especially, a more concerted effort on the part of Hollywood to integrate its cast and to recognize people that traditionally hadn't been recognized. So you're starting to see, like, in background shots in a police station, there might be an African-American detective. So after 54, especially with new urgency, the NAACP and other civil rights groups are getting Hollywood to kind of, get off the dime that they've been on for since the foundation of Hollywood, with a more integrated cast. Now, needless to say, it takes a good while, because the American school systems, that phrase "all deliberate speed." Matt dated himself in the 80s, and I'll date myself in the 60s. I went to school in Montgomery, Alabama in the late 60s, and our school was not integrated until 1970, my senior year. And so if you think of the time lapse from 1954 to 1970, that the deliberate speed part really wasn't executed. But you are starting to see gradually, if you're looking for it, other kinds of representatives. So, Native Americans or Mexicans in the Southwest, and then occasionally you'll see an African-American figure, but not all that much. I'm sure, Matt and you both know the obvious landmark is Night of the Living Dead, which is I believe it's celebrated as the first film in which one of the main characters is Black, and at no point in the narrative do they mention that. So usually if you had an African-American character, there'd be some moment in the film where that would be a topic of conversation. And one of the things that makes Night of the Living Dead kind of oddly unnerving for an American audience in 1968 is the fact that you have this African-American protagonist and nothing's ever said about it.
Well, talk about the legacy now. And I think what I'll do is I'll name off a few of the other Bug films, but then I'll go to Tom first to talk about the legacy of this film. So Them is the first big Bug feature film. And there's also Tarantula, The Deadly Mantis, The Black Scorpion, Beginning of the End, Monster from Green Hell, Cosmic Monsters, which also had the name The Strange World of Planet X in the UK, and then Earth versus Spider. And these are the ones I found in the 50s. So, Matt, what's the legacy of Them?
That's a very, very interesting question. So the legacy of Them, I guess, depends on how you understand them. So there are some people who would say that the legacy of Them is that it pushed forward this kind of advance towards the nuclear fear in American science fiction cinema, the move towards the kind of anti-communism that lurked underneath it. And it very much did, it was a relatively early contributor to that. And so the immediate legacy is that it pushes those kind of those Cold War themes in films to a level of popularity. In the medium term, though, as the golden age of science fiction cinema kind of wanes, and we find ourselves in the 60s, 60s. Actually, there are many more bug movies in the 60s than other types of science fiction in the initial period. So whilst the tropes of the 50s science fiction films were dying out, you still got big bugs, you still got giant monsters for a good long time. Through to kind of the mid-60s, it's really kind of things like 2001 that reforge science fiction as a, in all inverted commas, kind of serious genre, right? But the trend for these slightly campier, slightly sillier, slightly lower grade, I think, films, that continued. And them, unfortunately, is seen as part of the genesis of that. I say unfortunately because them is a much better movie than most of these were. And I don't want to be thought of as saying that them led a trend lower in quality. It did, but not because it was itself lower in quality, but rather because its theme was so exploitable that actually by the time we got into the 60s, those films were being produced quite cheaply, quite quickly, and being exploited to the maximum level, In longer terms, well, if you look at things like Eight-Legged Freaks from the early 2000s, if you look at the Wild Wild West film with Will Smith, there are big bug movies all over the place in more recent film history. And actually, if you look at a lot of the designer creatures in less kind of buggy science fiction films, but if you look at designer creatures in A Quiet Place, for instance, there's something buggy about them. There's something kind of insectoid about them. So that association between the insect, the alien monstrosity, and science fiction, particularly science fiction horror, that's not gone anywhere, right? That really hasn't. And although, you point out that King Kong had, creepy crawlies on a mass scale, that didn't really popularize them. They didn't catch on. It was them that started that drive towards the insectoid, the creepy crawly, and particularly the giant creepy crawly as a source of threat. And that's not gone anywhere. It's lurked around. And yes, now it's often done in a retro fashion. It's done ironically. It's done as a nod and a wink back to what once was. But it's still there.
And I think, as Matt mentioned, the other great thing about having a prototype like Them, which is a really good film, but it's about ants, you can see how cagey producers would go, well, let's do tarantulas, let's do flies, let's do praying mantises, etc. That the generic innovation that you can do to the generic convention is, if you're an exploitation filmmaker, it's kind of a ready-made template now that you've got. And you don't have to do it as well, but you can sort of feed off some of the impulses of the original film. And in the case of Them, it really isn't going to be as good. So the next year you do get Tarantula, which I don't share your admiration for a tarantula. I'm sorry to say that it doesn't.
I really enjoyed it, but I understand what you're saying in terms of quality. But they use a real bug, which I think is fantastic.
I'm sorry, it's 2 out of 3. I'm with Aisha here.
Oh, you are? I'm sorry, you guys have target fixation. Like, you just like the bug, So you kind of overlook the fact that the couple in it is totally unpersuasive. The acting,
the chemistry isn't there, but
there's
a
no
real big hairy spider.
And as I think we've talked about, one of the things that really delivers on M is you have a pretty nice set of ensemble character actors in a realistic locale, and you sort of believe that the film is confident enough to take time on scenes that you would think they would eliminate if they just wanted to get to the bug. So you have that sort of little interlude of police procedural where James Arness and James Whitmore are just kind of going around interviewing people for like a few minutes of witnesses. And you could take that out, but what it does is it shows you we're in a real locale and I'm going to spend time with this. And most of the films don't do that.
Yeah, Them seems more genuine in that regard. I just wanted to quickly mention a few things. Leonard Nimoy is very briefly in Them. Spock is in Them. It got me so excited because I did not expect it and had to rewind it and play it again and go, yep, that's definitely Leonard Nimoy. So he's in that. And in Tarantula, which, we're kind of covering, Clint Eastwood comes in at the end as a pilot. Brilliant. And
I knew none of this. I'm astonished. Thank you. Like, this is completely new knowledge to me.
Wonderful. And one more thing is the influence. Flamethrowers, big kind of bug-like creatures. James Cameron, Alien, Ellen Ripley. Absolutely. I think that must be a huge influence on the film.
Once upon a time in Hollywood, where, the famous scene where Rick asks if they can make the flamethrower not quite as hot, and the guy says, "Rick is a flamethrower."
The alien thing is also interesting. Because it's not just the flamethrower; it's also the eggs and the question of hatching, right? Like the going down into the sewers and the caves here is all about finding out whether the eggs have hatched and whether there's another queen out there threatening us. Well, if there's another queen threatening to hatch from eggs, etc., etc., I mean, that's just the logic of Alien, right? Like there's such a debt paid there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, final question. What would you recommend to listeners to pair with this film? Tom, you go first.
Well, I think that the obvious pairing is the one that we've just mentioned, is them back to back with Aliens, because it has so many of the themes, not just the flamethrower, but going after the queen and going into the recesses of the tunnel as a kind of subterranean psychological space where you're confronting your fears.
Brilliant. Thank you. Matt, what do you think?
I'm going to use this as an opportunity to shamelessly promote one of my favourite movies of the 50s, which is absolute trash, absolute rubbish. And yet I adore it so much. If we're going down that kind of, that young mass of the early 90s, I guess, watching them on a sofa, feeling like there's something campy and silly and watching the world burn, then I cannot recommend strongly enough, with tongue in cheek, the 1958, I believe it is, Attack of the Crab Monsters, which is a ridiculous American movie where there's been it's set on an atoll in the Pacific. There's been a nuclear bomb go off. And in the words, almost quite directly, the radiation has acted like jelly or jello with the crabs and made them bigger, but kind of wibblier and wobblier. And they have lasers on their heads and they can steal your voice. And they gradually cut the island up so that bits of it float off. And a load of scientists have to start hiding from them in an ever-shrinking landscape. It's wonderful and dreadful, and I love it. And it has so many echoes of them. But in that, as Tom and I were talking about earlier, that kind of lower quality echoes of it that followed. It's, I think it's an absolute trashy masterpiece.
Yeah. And I get the feeling, Matt, that you kind of revel in those kinds of films anyway.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You're a serious lecturer.
I'm not sure anyone's ever said that about me before.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you for coming on the show.
A pleasure.
Not at all, thank you.
That's it for this episode. Next episode, we'll be having an end of year special where I'll be taking bits and pieces of all the conversations I've edited, things that you haven't heard yet, and putting them together. And I hope you enjoy it. So until then, bye-bye.